All across the internet today, I'm seeing these glossy write-ups about Mathias Döpfner, owner of a bunch of stuff. But in this case, the thing we're interested in is Politico, who has what is being described as a contrarian plan for the website, which is an interesting way to pitch it. We're gonna get into what he actually believes, what he actually wants politically. But let's jump into a little bit of the more critical coverage of what's going on here. Says he's concerned that the American press has become too polarized. You probably hear that a lot. Legacy brands like the New York Times, the Washington Post are drifting to the left. That's such an interesting spin. While conservative media falls under the sway of Trumpian alternative facts. So in Politico, he sees a grand opportunity. Quote, we want to prove that being nonpartisan is actually the more successful positioning. He called it his biggest and most contrarian bet. And so the idea coming out of this and all this coverage is everybody's radical and partisan and they all want things. They're all advocating for things. We're not gonna do that. We're just gonna be the news, neutral and objective the way it used to be. But is that actually what first of all, is that what Politico is right now? I think is a perfectly interesting question to delve into, but is that actually gonna be what he wants? Well, apparently in the weeks leading up to the 2020 election, he sent an email to executives that said, do we all want to get together for an hour in the morning of November 3rd and pray that Donald Trump will again become president of the United States of America? Now look, everybody can have whatever political opinion they want. Advocating for group prayer to keep Trump as president seems like a pretty strong endorsement from your point of view. Anyway, his email was apparently inspired by a news story he shared about the government's plan to sue Google for abuse of market dominance. Apparently that's an issue he really cared about. Went on to argue that Trump had made the right moves on 5 of what he deemed the 6 most important issues of the last 50 years. Defending the free democracies against Russia and China, pushing NATO allies to up their contributions, tax reforms, Middle East peace efforts, as well as challenging tech monopolies. If falling short, he implied, on climate change. Well, aren't you merciful to acknowledge that? I think it's crazy that you think that he did good stuff on those other areas, but at least you acknowledge the climate change thing. And he concluded by saying no American administration in the last 50 years has done more. So here is the issue. It is one thing to claim that you're gonna be neutral when there's good evidence that that's not where you stand. But then to clownishly pretend that that evidence doesn't exist, I think goes even beyond that. He was asked about the email, and he initially responded with a forceful denial. Quote, that's intrinsically false. That doesn't exist. It has never been sent and has never been even imagined. Never in all of the realms of man has anyone conceived of the possibility of that email being sent. Well, when he was shown a printout of the email, which it turns out had been both imagined and sent, he allowed a glimmer of recognition. It's possibly said that he may have sent the email as an ironic, provocative statement in the circle of people that hate Donald Trump, because that's exactly the kind of ironic, provocative thing that Döpfner, a garrulous and enthusiastic texter, likes to do. That is me, he said. That could be. So apparently it can be imagined. And I want to ask the audience one question before we discuss. Do you know the difference between someone who advocates for Trump and MAGA stuff and someone who likes to trollishly joke about liking Trump and MAGA stuff? Do you know the big difference? If you do, send me a message because I haven't been able to figure one out. They're the same people, that's all they are. Irony is a paper thin shield that they will hide behind. They want him to be president because they like what he does. But anyway, Ben, it's a ridiculous story, but what do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, I love the mention of climate change because he's like, I want to be clear. As an eco-fascist, I'm deeply upset that Donald Trump is just a regular fascist. Like, come on. And because especially like the New York Times is too far to the left. The New York Times is too far to the left. Literally, New York Times, Washington Post, all these major media outlets just spent months like spinning ridiculous, over the top, nonsensical, like doomsday, like, oh no, the world will fall from the sky about Chile's constitution, right? Chile tried to pass a new constitution and they did every single thing that they could to make sure that the protections for women weren't in there, to make sure that the protections for indigenous people weren't there, the protections for the environment. I mean, seriously, come on. Like these like by any measure, the New York Times and all of these outlets are these extreme right neoliberal outlets. The only way that they look left is when you compare them to the Alex Joneses, the Newsmaxes, the OANs, right? The Fox Newses. That is the only thing that makes them seem left in any regard. And they're still desperate to give some type of credit to Republicans and Trump. And so, although it's not shocking to see that this person owns Politico, because Politico, I think, has had some very notoriously terrible takes on their platform. But it's just wild. It's just wild.
100%. And look, this goes back to the conversation we were having earlier in the show about bias. And even discussions of bias are, ironically, biased, because in choosing to identify certain sources of bias, you're distracting from other sources. So like the idea that Politico might become more right-wing, which I think some people will read this story and think, sort of hides the fact that no, it's already been like wildly pro-establishment, and that's really the fundamental biggest issue. It is an insider's news source. That's what it is. They generally accept that the way things are the way they should be, and that anyone coming in to rock the boat is an issue. And it's easy if that's the territory that you occupy, it is easy to focus overmuch on the left as radicals because the left wants to do things with government. Whereas the corporatists in both the Democratic and the Republican Party are largely content to leave things the way they are because the way they are benefits them and their donors. They're doing quite well the way things are. I mean, sure, they'd like to, every time the Republicans win the presidency, they're gonna throw a couple trillion more dollars in tax cuts at the rich or whatever, but they're also doing very well right now. And that fundamentally is the big issue. Bias isn't just in how you describe things, it's what you cover, what you consider to be acceptable, what counts as radical. Even as we often point out, the idea of who's a moderate, who's a centrist. Well, generally it's whoever places like Politico decide that are a moderate or a centrist. They get to be the good people, the non-radicals. Everyone else is the outsider. They're the crazies. That's the sort of bias that we need to worry about. And so I don't know if this guy being the owner or whatever is gonna result in them being more deferential to Trump. I mean, the fact that this is coming out at the same time that CNN is making all the moves they've made to be less anti-Trump is a little bit worrying. But even if it doesn't, it's still going to be biased towards the status quo, towards the political establishment, the economic establishment that informs much of both the Democratic and Republican parties. Any other thoughts, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, really, it just speaks to how unhinged the United States is as a country, politically speaking. Because the reality is, if we're talking about who is moderate, who's the center, Bernie Sanders, AOC, Cory Bush, the Squad, they represent the political center of basically any other country, right? The policies that they push for are social democratic policies. They're not even talking about completely uprooting capitalism. They're just hey, maybe working class people deserve a few more perks of theoretically living in one of the richest countries in the world. But they're painted as being these extreme radicals. Meanwhile, people get to claim to be centrists while advocating for continuing imperialist wars. They claim to be these galaxy brain geniuses who are yes, I'm such a brilliant centrist, and that's why I'm advocating for the United States invading Bolivia to get lithium, right? Those are the center. That's the moderate position to these people is uprooting democracies for our own material wealth.
Yeah. By the way, I appreciate the plug of Galaxy Brain there. You gotta fit that in. For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.